Hello, and welcome to the lecture on right hemisphere brain damage, or RHD. In this mini lecture, we're going to talk about causes, symptoms, and a little bit of background. When we meet in class, we will dive a little bit more into the details, and we'll also look at the more clinical side. So we'll talk about assessment and treatment in this population when we're together in person. So right hemisphere brain damage can be caused by a few different things. So most often we will see this as a result of a CVA or a stroke. Right hemisphere brain damage can also be caused by a traumatic brain injury, brain tumors or surgeries, or infections. It can even be caused by a seizure disorder. When we look at frequency, more specifically in strokes, 42 to 49% of strokes are caused by damage to the right hemisphere of the brain. So something to really think about when you consider this information and these numbers are that oftentimes left-sided strokes are more easily recognized by healthcare providers. So left side strokes can lead to more clear symptoms in some cases. So something like aphasia is something that would stand out pretty easily to a caregiver or even a healthcare provider. Someone with a right-sided stroke might have less explicit deficits. So they may be experiencing spatial disorientation. That's something that could very easily be missed by a loved one or, again, even a healthcare provider. So there's a couple common stroke scales that are used. So the NIS, for example, the National Institute of Health Stroke Scale, or the FAST, the Face Arm Speech Test. These are pretty common stroke scales, but both of them really emphasize symptoms that are caused or associated with left-sided strokes. So that can lead to right-sided strokes being um, easily missed or maybe even just delayed in their diagnosis. So what symptoms would you expect? Someone with damage to the right side of the brain, I want you to think for just a second about what symptoms or what deficits might you expect in this population. So just based on what you know about the brain, typically language is stored on the left side of the brain, not always, right? So we know that each individual's brain is never going to be the same. This picture just gives us a bit of an idea of what area or what aspects are controlled by different areas of the brain. So someone with damage to the right side of the brain might experience deficits in insight and inhibition. They may also even present with left neglect. We'll get into that a little bit later. Also, we know that we can't just look at one side of the brain, right? Because not only is everyone's individual brain going to be much different, but the deficits are also going to depend on which lobe or which specific area of that right hemisphere is damaged. So this is another picture, just kind of a quick, easy reference sheet of typically what someone's brain or what parts of the brain would control in someone. Again, no one's brain will be the same. So what might that look like? So presentation of language deficits in RHD. So we're going to focus this slide will be on discourse. So discourse comprehension. Someone with RHD might have a difficult time understanding abstract language, figurative language, or lexical ambiguities. They might have a difficulty making inferences and also understanding global meanings of discourse. So maybe you tell them a story or you're talking about something that happened in your day. Someone with right hemisphere brain damage is going to have a very hard time understanding that your overall topic, your gist, or even the big picture from what you're saying. Or even, watching a movie, something, getting that overall big picture is going to be very difficult. Someone with RHD might have a very hard time understanding jokes, irony, or sarcasm. Again, thinking about those abstract concepts, abstract language is very difficult to understand in this population. They may also have a hard time understanding others' emotions. So we'll talk about this a little bit more in class, but that's something that can be very upsetting and difficult for the caregivers and loved ones of people with right hemisphere brain damage. So discourse production, some deficits that we'll see. Someone with RHD might be very verbose. A lot of times their language is very egocentric. They'll have tangential comments, frequent digressions from the topic. They may focus on irrelevant details when they're telling their story or using language. Thoughts can become very disorganized. And we'll also notice that they're fairly impulsive when they're speaking. So something like maybe your client with RHD gets to your session a little bit late and you ask why they were late or what happened on the way over. And they say, well, I was driving on the road and my gas light came on. So I pulled over to the side of the road and I realized I was out of gas. So it was strange because I was so hungry too. And I looked in my bag and I didn't see that I had any snacks in there. And then I wondered why I was so hungry. And I realized that I had skipped breakfast, which is weird because I always eat breakfast. And there's that one restaurant downtown, in Phoenix. Have you ever been there? It's the one where they have the bacon and egg special on Wednesdays. And so and off they go. So instead of being able to say, oh, my gas light came on, I had run out of gas, it has turned into a conversation about breakfast or their favorite breakfast restaurant in downtown Phoenix. So that could be a very common conversation with somebody with RHD. Other language deficits that we'll see are in these areas. So pragmatic changes, sometimes someone with right hemisphere brain damage will have reduced eye contact. They'll have a difficult time with turn taking in conversation. You may even also notice decreased initiation of conversation. They may also present with deficits in semantic processing, so difficulty understanding the metaphorical meaning of words. Prosody can also be impaired, so they may have decreased variation in their pitch, loudness, intonation. Their overall rhythm to meaning and emotion can be impaired. This population may also present with a flat affect, so they may have reduced emotional expression or diminished facial expressions. So in addition to not being able to understand others' emotions, they're going to have a hard time expressing that as well. Cognitive deficits that we might see in this population, impaired reasoning and judgment, that kind of goes with that impulsivity. They might have deficits in attention, so more specifically sustained and selective. We will see deficits in sequencing and problem solving, in executive functioning, in inhibition, and like I just mentioned, in that recognition of facial expression. So other deficits that you might see in this population, emotional liability, so having really decreased control of those emotions. They may get very upset very quickly. It might seem kind of sudden to those that they're around. They also sometimes will present with dysphagia, dysarthria, or hemiparesis or hemiplegia. So the next point there on this slide is about visual neglect. So oftentimes we'll see left visual neglect in this population. I do have a video that I'd like to share with you so you can access the slides and get to the video that way, but we will also watch it together in class. So we'll dive into that a little bit deeper later. Agnosogogia is another thing that we will see in this population. So that means that's a decreased or no awareness of deficits. So this person might not have any idea that there's anything wrong. So as you think about that, I want you to think about how that might impact your therapy session. So if someone has little to no awareness that a deficit exists, that could be pretty problematic for therapy, right? You'd have difficulty getting that buy-in. You'd have difficulty, helping them see the point of why they need to be in therapy. They may have a hard time understanding why they need to do homework, why they need to keep coming. They might not have the ability to see their progress over time. So that could really impact their recovery. So a little bit of research here. There's a gentleman named Howard Gardner from a while back that did a lot of research in this population. His research findings really complement and reinforce all the information that we just talked about. So he did some research at the Aphasia Research Center, and it all focused on language and language disturbances. So he looked at individuals with right hemisphere brain damage, individuals with left hemisphere brain damage, and also individuals with no impairment at all. When he looked at things like syntactic processing, detecting word meaning, reading, writing, and naming, the right hemisphere group really responded more like the unimpaired group than they did to the left hemisphere group. So they kind of aligned more with the unimpaired group in those areas. They didn't always align more with the unimpaired group. So again, it reinforces what we just talked about. Um, when Howard Gardner looked at things like sensitivity to jokes and cartoons, the right hemisphere group was more different than the unimpaired group than when the left hemisphere group was compared to the unimpaired group. So again, we see that deviation or that difficulty in understanding jokes, cartoons, abstract language or thoughts. He also looked at word connotations and denotations. So a denotation would be something like, it's a little bit more specific, right? So if we're talking about like social media, if you ask somebody, what is social media? They would say, oh, well, social media, it's websites, it's apps that enable users to create and share content, participate in social networking. And then if you ask someone for their connotation about social media, they might say, oh, you know, it's a time waster. It's always dramatic. There's a lot of misinformation out there. So the denotative meaning is something more concrete, where a connotative meaning is something a little bit more abstract, again, more related to someone's feelings or, again, just the big picture or the gist of something. So when he looked at denotation and connotation, the right hemisphere group performed better at matching words to denotation than connotations. The left hemisphere group, he didn't see any significant difference. So again, that aligns really with what we've been talking about. So someone with right hemisphere brain damage might have a pretty easy time matching a word to its more literal meaning, but not really to the abstract concept or connotation of what that word is. So the other thing he found, again, tracking with what we just talked about, story production, individuals with right hemisphere brain damage had a difficult time following the fate of characters. They very often miss the point of the story. Early research, so back in like the 50s to the 70s, in neurology showed that people with right hemisphere brain damage were really prone to confabulation, to circumlocution, emotional and social inappropriateness, and irregularities in humor. So on that note, I will say that Howard Gardner's research studies, the ones that were mentioned above, they were all from the 1970s and 1980s. So they are very old studies, but a lot of the more current research holds true to these things that he found. So we do have one case study, and this is from the real world. So there was a gentleman named William O. Douglas. He was a Supreme Court justice. In 1974, he suffered a right hemisphere CVA. So overall, the severity of his injury was really downplayed by the press. He was out of the hospital. It was, oh, this is not a big deal. He's getting back on his feet. Don't worry. So he returned to work and he started demonstrating really noticeable deficits to others. So other Supreme Court justices started to notice these big discrepancies and deficits. So a lot of times what they were doing, they were voting to postpone cases where his vote would make a difference. They were really trying to divert any work divert cases from his workload because they were seeing that the cognition and the reasoning was impaired. So eventually this gentleman submitted his resignation, but he still was filing opinions. So again, it's a little bit of that insight to deficits, understanding what's going on. He wasn't quite there. After that, so again, he had resigned, but he was still filing opinions. They served him with a formal letter that was reminding him of his retirement and that his official duties were concluded. So here's just a little bit. This is from one of the studies, but essentially this is what they were noticing about William Douglas. So Douglas could speak well enough, but a good bit of what he said did not make much sense. It seemed on target for a while, but then veered away. He sought to make light of his own injury, even as he failed to appreciate the underlying intent of questions that were posed to him. Later, it turned out that Douglas caused enormous difficulty for his brethren on the court. Not only did he fail to realize his own deficits and instead insist that he was fit to serve, but his understanding of new legal cases and his ability to draw appropriately on his years of experience were clearly impaired. To validation from the clinical laboratory, I could now add fresh evidence from the Daily News. So basically what was happening in the 1970s, this happened, again, it was very downplayed by the press, and researchers started to notice what he was doing, and they had an example. So they really had this case study of saying all of our research is showing that someone with right hemisphere brain damage presents with these type of impairments. And then people started to notice what William Douglas was doing in the court, and it really aligned with the research. So just a case study to kind of validate the research that they were finding. All right, so that is all I have for you now. The last slide is references and resources. Thanks for listening. And like I said, we'll talk more about the clinical impressions in class. Thanks.